Right, so I think I agreed with a good deal of what Elder had to say. I want to address two issues. One, the Jerusalem capital of Israel issue, Jerusalem, West Jerusalem capital of Israel, East Jerusalem capital of Palestine. And the other issue that I'd like to address is the issue of what is affectionately known now as fake news. And both of those I want to analyze within the framework of what I find most problematic about Trump and his popularity, which is just how erratic, how, shall we say, people talk about anger management. He has impulse management problems, most visible in his tweeting. And so what I'd like to say is as follows. The move to recognize, to put the embassy in West Jerusalem, I think was a master stroke. I agree it could have been better prepared, and it's precisely the lack of preparation that makes me worry that while that's a great opening move on a chessboard, you can't win a game with opening moves, no matter how brilliant they are, or even opening gambits. And I don't think that Trump is somebody who thinks very far ahead. And I can see him getting caught into all kinds of problems. The initial move was great. The reaction of the Palestinians, which was by and large the spokesmen were hysterical, but the Palestinians as a group barely objected. There were jokes about, there were more reporters at Damascus Gate than there were demonstrators and so on. And all of that, I think, really showed just how little sort of angry, aggressive, hysterical support the PA is able to mobilize. But again, that's something to take advantage of rather than just to sort of have it. I got kicked off the soccer team at college because I made beautiful passes and then sat and sort of watched how nice they were. And the coach is saying, keep running, you're supposed to get the return pass, and I'm going, wow, what a pass. And I think that the problem is that Trump is the kind of person to make great moves and then not play the rest of the hand. I won't go into why I think the move to have Jerusalem move the capital, move the embassy here was brilliant, because I actually think it was brilliant with lots of implications. But let me go to the second issue, which is the issue that troubles me the most, and that's the issue of fake news. One of the key issues in fake news is the ability of fake news to go from the margins where it's created to the mainstream. In the history of fake news, there has never been a more complete and sustained campaign of fake news than the way the Western mainstream news media has treated Israel, especially since 2000, especially since the outbreak of the Intifada. I don't think that anybody can come up with so long and sustained a career for this, and the damage not just to Israel and to any Palestinians who want to live in peace is enormous, but the damage to the West is enormous. I even coined the term own goal war journalism to describe how Westerner journalists, thinking they're just sticking it to Israel by running Palestinian lethal narratives as news, were actually screwing their own people, because these aren't Palestinian narratives, these are jihadi narratives, and they're basically mainstreaming the war propaganda of their enemies as news in their own public sphere. And it's an absolute catastrophe, and I gotta say that although Trump's election illustrated just how off the rails the mainstream news media had become in terms of covering things as they wished they were, and also I think as they wished people would see them so that they would do things like vote the way they thought they should. His handling of fake news has not led to a fruitful discussion about fake news, but in the same way as you said, polarizing the good Jews from the bad Jews, it's polarized the right and the left to the point where each side, as soon as they hear fake news, well, people, it's amazing. You know, you talk to people, and on the one hand, they'll use the word fake news to accuse the other side, and then when you talk about fake news on their side, they say, what are you, Trumpist, or what are you, some kind of radical global progressive left, etc. So I think that our ability to think clearly has, in fact, in the public sphere, has in fact been damaged. Now, I do see some signs of hope, and in that sense, you know, there have been a number of things like Jordan Peterson and Jonathan Haidt and so on, who have sort of started to open up a space where some of the moral hysteria that drives us is toned down, and we can actually start talking about things. But you know, that's just the germ of something, and I don't know if it's going to take. And I don't see Trump as somebody who's sort of nurturing that space. I see him as somebody who's just part of the dysfunctionality that has led at least some people to that space. So overall, is Trump good for the Jews? In the short run, no question. But you know, chocolate tastes good in the short run, and then you end up looking like me. Everything that tastes good isn't always good, and particularly isn't always good for you. You know, the fact that Trump just sort of swatted away the nonsense that was coming out of the left, including Hillary Clinton and so on, I think so enthralled people that rather than vote for serious candidates with serious political experience, they voted for this guy just because it was like, finally somebody who's going to, you know, stick it to them. And given how badly the other side had behaved, it's understandable. Understandable, but not necessarily the greatest thing in the world. So let me conclude by saying that I was joking with a journalist the other day about how, you know, Jews like to worry. Give them good news and they'll worry. 67 war, something's going to go wrong. You know, no matter how good the news is, we can always think of some way that it's going to go wrong. And I make fun of people like that. But then I also have to say, I'm susceptible to it as well. And what really disturbs me about Trump is what's the expression, unstable as water. I just don't feel that this guy has a compass. I think he's got sort of flashes of intuition, even moral intuition, but I don't think he has a compass, and I don't think he has ballast, and that's what I think we need now.
Yes, so questions?
Oh yeah, sure.
Yes.
I have great unease about his peace cabinet of, you know, Jared and Jason, and even though I feel like they have more compass than he does, I'm not sure where the hell they're going, and I wonder what your take on that.
Well, look, you know, I just finished writing a chapter on responses to 9/11 for my book, and one of the things that struck me in going over Bush's unbelievably lame speech to the Muslim, I forget what, community center in Washington, 4 days after 9/11, you know, Islam is a religion of peace, Muslims the whole world over, we're shocked and horrified just like you and me and the fine people behind me, and of course he's talking about members of CARE and the Muslim Brotherhood and so on. And then he reads a passage that says the exact opposite of what he seems to think it says from the Quran. What deeply disturbs me is how far off even what we call the right wing is. In other words, really sober thinking about what's going on in the world today is not even a question of between the right and the left. It's like there are very few people I read who seem to really understand what's at stake. So, for instance, the Jerusalem thing. Palestinians shouldn't have a capital in Jerusalem. This is the cheapest piece of envy. There's an anthropologist who calls it mimetic desire. You know, if you want it, I want it. If you don't want it, you know, when we weren't here, they couldn't care less. And then all of a sudden, we like it, so they want it, right? And the world should be saying to them, grow up, take Ramallah, and be happy. But they're not. So in that sense, I really think that it would be very hard. I mean, in a sense, that's why I'm in favor of the status quo, because until we can find our bearings, trying to solve this is suicide, even with right-wing solutions.
I have a question that's slightly only based on your being a historian. I'm just interested in this. One of the things I brought up last year that one of my concerns was that the pendulum seems to be swinging higher and higher with each presidential election since Clinton. You know, Clinton was sort of middle of the road, but sort of left.
Right.
You know, Bush was a little bit more to the right. Obama was far more to the left.
Right.
Trump is off the charts, whatever he is. So my
is.
concern is, you know, does this mean that the next person is going to be a Keith Ellison or an Oprah or whatever?
Yeah.
And is that a concern that we should be?
That's a huge concern. I actually think that, first of all, it's widening gyres, to quote the poet. I think that one of the really serious things is that, you know, right now we're making hay while the sun shines, but, you know, when the Democrats come back, I consider Obama did as much damage as he could as a stealth candidate. It was never openly, and he did what he could to cover himself by giving a lot of money to Israel and so on and so forth. I think the next candidate will be much more openly the next Democratic president. I think it's a catastrophe. I mean, if you look at what's happening to the Democratic Party right now with this stuff about the Women's March, and 3 out of the 4, you know, and Black Caucus members telling the Jews, "How dare you tell me what to do?" when they're telling us what to do all the time. I mean, it's staggering. But you know, I mean, I view all this from the point of view of cognitive war, and I gotta say, if I were a jihadi, I'd be going, bring on a second Trump administration, bring on the next, you know, bring on Keith Ellison.
But from a historic perspective, has there been times like this where you see the pendulum swinging wider and wider, and what causes it to stop?
Well, it's hard to say because you're talking about democracies.
Right, yeah.
And the history of democracy isn't that long. Mm-hmm. I don't think we've ever seen anything quite like this.
I think we have, actually.
Go ahead.
I think we have.
Go ahead.
It's certainly not in the same terms, but if you look at what happened in the French Revolution, and eventually it took about 30 years till things stabilized.
Right. Of course, stabilized isn't. The revolutionaries would say everything went back to where it started. But that's not democratic. That's a revolution against an autocratic regime.
It started out as democratic.
Yes.
Democratic aspirations.
Briefly, I mean, we're talking about a sustained democracy in which you have. It's very rare to have a democracy in which the opposition wins and takes over without violence. So that's already huge. And now we're talking about 3, 4, 5 changes of power each time the pendulum swinging more wildly. You know, the French Revolution is a good example in the sense that there is almost built into any kind of revolutionary dynamic this tendency to go to the extreme. So, and I do think that we live, I wouldn't say revolutionary times, but I'd say that a lot of the people who live in our times think they're carrying out a revolution. And in that sense, they have this what's the term, elective affinity for being more radical every chance they get. And that, I think, again, is a catastrophe. I think I should leave some time for other people.
Yeah, sure. It's up. Okay. Unless anybody else has a specific question. Okay, thank you.